I'm going to risk embarrassment on stage and say thank you, Agnushka. Okay, brilliant. Okay. It's a great honor to be here and to have met so many wonderful people in pursuit of the common shared goal of liberty. So thank you for having me. My name is Robbie Miles. I am a professional investor in London, but I also sit on the council of Live and Let Live, the global peace movement that I'm here to represent. We live in the best of times. In just 100 years, deaths from starvation are down 98%. This is despite the human population growing 4 times bigger. In 1900, the probability of a child dying within the first 5 years of their life was 36%. Today, it's just 4%. Deaths from natural disasters are down 94% in 100 years. Again, this is despite the human population going from 2 to 8 billion in that time. In the last 20 years alone, the proportion of people living in extreme poverty has halved. The black versus white employment gap has never been lower, and 90% of girls are now in primary school education versus 65% in 1970. Joy Kim's incredibly moving account of North Korea reminds us that this good news is not evenly distributed, and I offer my heartfelt hope and prayer for the freedom of all oppressed countries. But in the Western world, we're so fortunate that it has never been easier to access what we want, to live our true expression, and to be our authentic selves. The point is this: we have never seen a time this good to start something new. Meeting our basic physiological and safety needs, i.e. the base of the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, has never been easier. This gives us capacity to move up that hierarchy and focus on creating new models of peaceful coexistence. If we get these models right, there is potential for us to not only halve the number of people living in poverty in another 20 years, but relegate poverty to the history books entirely. Though it is common to highlight the shortcomings, the shortcomings of the world, we now have more slack than ever before to explore how to move beyond merely surviving towards thriving. Timing is everything. Not only do we have the necessary slack, but we have the healthy apathy and disillusionment of the status quo. In the US today, the proportion of people identifying as independent is 49%, up from 30% just 20 years ago. This might indicate the highest appetite for change since we Brits ruled America. We also just had the biggest truly global event of our recent history. Humans are now more connected, and our collective consciousness is more globally aware than ever because of the pandemic. The timing is ripe for the next major evolutionary leap in our model of co-inhabitation. The time is ripe for a leap towards global peace. Enter the Live and Let Live global peace movement. This movement offers an answer to the question of what this model of peaceful co-inhabitation might look like. This peace movement is not saying anything new. It builds on a rich history of an incredibly bright flame from the Magna Carta, the flame of liberty, from the Magna Carta 800 years ago to the classical liberals, to the American revolutionaries, all the way to the most recent contributors to liberty thinking in recent years. The peace movement merely highlights and expounds the powerful aphorism hiding in plain sight: live and let live. 4 words, 2 imperatives. The first, live. You are the queen or king of you. As the competent adult owner of your life, you should be in charge of creating, directing, running, and organizing your life. Like all other competent adults, you have the right to decide for yourself what you believe about the world and how best to live your life. This means you alone have the right to both define and peacefully pursue your happiness however you choose to define it. It should be obvious that you are the rightful owner of your body, including your mind, all your peacefully acquired property, your money, and your time. This imperative, live, is an empowering invitation to recognize that the cage door is open. You are lucky to be alive, conscious, and on the planet right now. The pleasure in being compassionate, the gift of giving, the joy of letting curiosity be your guide. These are ours to discover and enjoy. As with all things, this body too will expire. Seize the day. Discover what is authentically true for you and act accordingly, except for one thing. You are not free to impede other people's freedom. Which brings us to the second imperative, let live. We must allow other competent adults the exact same reciprocal right to be the sovereign and sole owner of their body, property, and time. To impose one's morality on others, i.e. to not allow others to control their property, is to ultimately advocate aggression against them. For freedom and peace to proliferate, we must be willing for competent adults to insist on using their bodies, property, and money or time in ways we personally might find immoral, unhealthy, or unwise. This is the price of liberty. Simply put, to agree with the phrase, live and let live, is to oppose all involuntary interactions between competent adults. From this phrase, we derive a practical philosophy, abbreviated to 3LP, that is implemented, that I should say, when implemented, will dramatically improve the world. The 3LP contains two fundamental but crucially different principles. Most people will enthusiastically agree with both. Number one, don't aggress. Number two, be a good or excellent human. The first principle, don't aggress, is mandatory. It is the legal principle. The second principle, be an excellent human, is merely a suggestion that people are free to ignore without formal consequence. This is the moral principle. These two rules are simple enough even for kids to understand, and we believe most reasonable people would agree with them. In fact, it is the reasonable people that we are targeting. The key to dramatically improving our lives lies in the distinction between these two principles. The essence of our message is that the only way to achieve global freedom, peace, and prosperity is to adhere and reason consistently with both principles. Because it is a practical political philosophy, we don't care why you agree with them. Many people do not aggress and be a good human because of their religious views. In fact, live and let live is sort of the golden rule that pervades all religions at some level. But others agree because of philosophical, practical, or common sense reasons. While these are interesting matters to discuss, our movement doesn't reach these questions. If you genuinely agree with the two principles and that they apply to all people and issues equally, we'd be honored to welcome you to the movement, regardless of your gender, race, ethnicity, religious views, or sexual preferences. If you wish, sign up by scanning this barcode, and it should take you to the sign-in page. There's no costs, no obligations. It simply adds your name to the statement, I am for live and let live. This talk contains very few of my personal views. Instead, our goal is to offer a legal and moral framework for people with different views on many issues to peacefully live as they prefer while fostering freedom, peace, and prosperity. Though the two principles sound simplistic, we can derive all the needed laws, rules, and regulations directly from these two principles without ever having to be inconsistent. The founder of 3L, Mark Victor, is a practicing attorney for 30 years. He and the council has spent hundreds of cumulative hours stress testing the 3LP, the live and let live principle. As an aside, I would say that Mark Victor is a truly fantastic instigator of this movement. He's humble, and he lives the true example of what it is to be these legal and moral principles in action. He is quick to say that this freedom movement is nothing about him, and he advocates it purely to achieve global freedom. I'm going to really flatter him and say that his low-ego approach to leadership echoes that of George Washington. So specifically, what do we mean by don't aggress the legal principle? We define aggression as follows: initiating non-consensual force against another person or their property, engaging in fraud, coercion, or even creating a substantial risk of harm. In layman's terms, we mean murder, assault, theft, white-collar crime, domestic violence, rape, extortion, fraud, or thuggery. We also mean pollution, where that's material, and things like firing a rifle up in the air, drunk driving, etc. There are also less serious forms of aggression that violate the legal principle nonetheless, identified as follows: breaching a valid contract, engaging in unreasonable conduct causing harm to another person or property, breaching a fiduciary duty. Self-defense is not initiation of aggression, nor is the voluntary aggression, for example, between boxers. What is not considered aggression is speech, no matter how offensive, aggressive, rude, or insulting or disrespectful the words are, and no matter how much hurt feelings or psychological anguish they might cause. As hard as it might be in practice, we do have a choice in whether we let words upset us. We can choose to not take it personally, to not be lessened by them. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Our goal is to harmonize all laws and constitutions with the 3LP. Said another way, the law should always prohibit all forms of aggression, whether that's by an individual, a group of people, like a corporation or a government. Perhaps the most difficult part of the message for people to understand and accept is that it remains wrong to violate the legal principle even to accomplish worthy goals. Aggressing, even to achieve worthy goals, always invites more aggression. People do not like to be aggressed upon, even by people who hold their best interests at heart. So what do we mean by be an excellent human? The moral principle. Of course, a global peace movement has to offer an answer to the question of the law, but peace requires more than just functioning law. It also requires cooperation and cohabitation. So in contrast to our intolerance for violence in the legal principle, we are tolerant and non-prescriptive on the moral principle of what exactly being an excellent human means. We might agree that drinking alcohol or smoking weed or prostitution or gambling are sins, but it doesn't matter, if it doesn't fall under the definition of aggression, these are not victim crimes, then it is a moral issue. And we defend your right to partake in those activities and to peacefully live the life you choose. Conflict arises when we impose our moral views on others. Reasonable minds can and do disagree about what and how to interpret these aspirational values. But in general, we take be an excellent human to mean the following: high character, or aiming to do the right thing for the right reasons. A commitment to thinking win-win. We should always seek to align our self-interests with the interests of others to achieve mutually beneficial results. Open-mindedness. We should remain willing to consider new or different ideas, opinions, and conclusions from the ones we currently hold. Tolerance. We should recognize that people look, speak, celebrate, love, think, act, and even live differently. Voluntary kindness towards others. We should aspire to be caring, compassionate, generous, and helpful towards others in need when we are not required to do so, and there is nothing tangible to gain. Civility towards others. We seek to inspire people to maintain a dignified demeanor of friendship, politeness, goodwill, and respect towards others. a commitment to truth, facts, and rational thought. We should be firmly committed to pursuing knowledge about what is objectively true about the nature of the universe. Building high levels of trust with others. Trust is the foundation upon which all human relationships are built. Our best relationships are ones where we have earned a high level of trust. Consistent self-improvement. We recognize no human is perfect. We all make mistakes, which we should enthusiastically own, accept full responsibility for, and constructively learn from. We should promote and maintain a commitment to excellence in all areas. We each have countless opportunities to improve in many ways. This is neither a complete list nor a recipe for a happy life. We do not make any comment about inner peace, which for many is the recipe for a truly happy life. It is just like a list that would contribute to a more peaceful society. The reason we have a moral principle and we need to inspire others to act morally, the reason we have a moral principle is because we need to inspire others to act morally, at least to some extent. If we are ever to achieve peace, we need compliance with the legal principle and to achieve freedom, but to achieve peace, we also must have a moral component. People that don't want to adhere to these aspirational values do not make good candidates to join Live and Let Live, but we defend their rights to freedom as long as they don't aggress. So some further explanation of the 3LP, the Live and Let Live principle. On the questions of rights, the 3L position is as follows. The legal principle is simply the substantial right to not be aggressed against. The right to a fair trial, our procedural right, is the necessary accompaniment to the fair enforcement of the legal principle. The substantive and procedural rights are the only rights necessary to achieve a free society and world. Any other rights should be derived directly from these two rights, and no other right should ever violate either of these two most basic rights. As such, we should scrupulously honor both rights. Of course, anyone enforcing the legal principle must also adhere to it. There can be no exception for groups of people. It should be said that repeating a short phrase like live and let live, as a parrot can do, is no substitute for a proper understanding of the underlying philosophy. Yes, a 3L world would be much simpler than the impossibly complex legal and regulatory systems of today, but we still have to understand and differentiate between the moral and legal principle. That understanding will be essential if we are to do the important job of defending freedom at the edges where most people do not tread. This comes back to the price of liberty. For example, free speech is never defended in the case of popular speech. It is the most unpopular or vile speech that affords us the opportunity to protect the right to free speech. Legally tolerating another person's conduct that does not violate the legal principle, especially in cases where we disagree with that behavior for any number of reasons, is the highest expression of a person who is genuinely committed to freedom. Civilized people can find an act immoral while still supporting its legality. There is no contradiction in such a position. On the contrary, it is indeed an enlightened position. This is not to say that we must remain silent in the face of unpleasant behavior. In fact, this is the key enhancement of 3L that it offers to the evolution of classical liberalism. Live and let live. The legal principle defines how we must treat each other, but the moral states how we should treat each other. Being an excellent human means at least not being bigoted, but for some, excellent means actively standing up for the oppressed. Just to be provocative, the moral principle could be interpreted as, to the extent that you wish, be generous according to your means, according to others' needs. Indeed, we are not anti-communism. We are not even anti-government. That which we resist persists. As Mary Ruett astutely points out, the government occupies the parental archetype in many people's minds. People don't want to hear that they have an abusive parent. Instead, we are simply anti-aggression. If we can get you to agree on this, it is the catch-all that takes care of everything else. Don't tread on me and taxation is theft. These slogans make sense to the mind, but live and let live appeals to the heart and mind. We are aiming for a global peace movement, which means giving confidence to the most vulnerable people that they will not be neglected in a free world. This brings us to the practical interpretations. While reasonable minds will agree on 99% of the live and let live philosophy, we recognize that there are some subjects where reasonable minds might disagree in their interpretation. Rather than getting caught up in these fringe cases where reasonable minds disagree, we simply delegate the choice to the local community. If a person living in a particular local community is offended by the specific reasonable interpretation of the legal principle on a complex issue, then they can relocate to a different community that shares their interpretation. Communities will ultimately compete for talent by having the most favorable, most free interpretations of the live and let live principle. Reasonable minds generally agree that gambling, prostitution, sexual choices, sexuality, drug use, euthanasia, and freedom of speech do not violate the legal principle. Racism and discrimination is more contentious, so let's examine it. We are clear that bigoted people do not make suitable members of the live and let live movement. As with any moral issue, we can peacefully seek to convince you of the superiority of a non-racist position. With racism, we should work mightily hard to persuade such intolerant people to voluntarily discard their moronic views and adopt more reasonable ones. What is also clear is that any violent racist action is a violation of the non-aggression principle, of the non-negotiable legal principle. But ultimately, if someone wants to make the economically suboptimal decision to exclude certain people from their business, that is their choice. As for reparations, the rightful owner of a property is always the person who should control that property, but that rightful ownership might be disputed. If a person claims another person is wrongfully in possession of their property, we should peacefully and rationally settle that dispute as we settle any other. Fortunately, there exists well-established rules in property and tort law, as well as rules of how we conduct trials to resolve such disputes fairly. The person who claims they are legally entitled to some particular item or property, personal or real, should be allowed to bring a claim in court to resolve the dispute fairly. Courts are generally well equipped to resolve such claims. However, generalized and non-specific claims against groups or of people sought to be enforced against innocent people should always be rejected. People are not legitimately responsible for the crimes of their ancestors or even parents or siblings. Regarding gun ownership, where no harm or substantial risk of harm exists, there would be no violation of the legal rule. Weapons that inherently cannot be used in self-defense because of the collateral damage, like nuclear or biological weapons, do violate the rule. Taxation. The controversy with taxation arises from an inability to envision how necessary services such as courts, police, defense, public defenders could be provided to people who currently cannot afford those services without taxation. Said another way, the objection is generally a practical one instead of a philosophical one about how the 3LP applies to this issue. The Live and Let Live movement does not advocate immediately or recklessly abolishing all taxation. Instead, the 3L movement advocates for a careful, rational, and fair and steady transition, allowing time for an alternative funding mechanism consistent with the 3LP to effectively replace taxation without compromising any necessary services or benefits to people who are justly entitled to them. We recognize that achieving the goal of replacing all taxation with alternative funding for necessary services may never be realized for various reasons. However, the 3LM applauds any responsible movement towards less taxation as a worthwhile endeavor that should continue until our goal of responsibly eliminating all taxation is realized. In the meantime, we can promote the adoption of voluntary welfare, like that of the Mormons, who pay 10% of their income back to the community as tithe. On immigration, we are pro-free movement to the extent that it doesn't violate trespass. Positive rights, like the right to healthcare, are not consistent with the 3LP. But again, there is a huge scope to help others in voluntary ways promoted in the moral principle. On abortion, as well as animal rights, because reasonable minds equally committed in good faith to properly implementing the 3LP can and do disagree on this question, the issue is appropriately left to the local communities to decide and implement. On pandemics, the 3LP recognizes that spreading disease is indeed putting people at significant risk of harm, but it does not prescribe how this avoidance of harm should be achieved. Clearly, forced lockdowns and forced vaccinations are a violation of the legal principle. Climate change and pollution. Exactly what impact human activity is having on the planet is a very complex subject, and likely too complex for any average person without specific scientific background to fully understand. What we can say is that trespass, including pollution, violates the legal principle when private property is damaged. In minor trespass, known as de minimis, like the smell of a neighbor's barbecue, we do not treat them as trespass because they are generally below the threshold of concern held by reasonable people in that community. While competent adults remain free to contract otherwise, in the absence of such an agreement, deeming these trespass de minimis and simply ignoring them is the proper course of action. For most human history, the law treated as de minimis gases released into the environment. However, assuming the climate change concerns are correct, and we should say that reliance on experts in legal matters is standard practice, this conduct's cumulative effects are no longer de minimis. It is therefore an actionable violation of the legal principle. Said another way, if a person's behavior releases harmful gases into the environment, resulting in actual harm or substantial risks to others, we should consider this as an actionable trespass. As with any other trespass, we can properly insist that a trespass either stop trespassing or purchase the right, otherwise known as a license or easement, to continue to use another's property. We can employ the same remedy to resolve the climate change and pollution-related issues. In the case of burning fossil fuels, we now can accurately calculate the amounts of harmful gases released into the environment from that activity. We can also approximate the amount of harmful gases released into the atmosphere from agriculture and industry. Furthermore, we can calculate the cost of removing those harmful gases from the environment through biological and geological carbon sequestration methods, such as planting trees or storing carbon underground. Indeed, companies are currently working on new and more efficient ways to reclaim carbon from the environment. By employing these existing and new methods of carbon remediation from the atmosphere and calculating the cost to do so, we can determine the real economic cost of the pollution and the actual cost of remediating it. By offering the trespasser the routine option to either stop trespassing or pay a trespass fee for the continued trespass, we can effectively resolve the climate change issue without resorting to violating the legal principle in any other way. So we can remove all climate change tax, subsidies, and regulation. So those are some fun examples of how 3L can cut through complex issues like a knife through butter. People sometimes ask, what is the practical purpose of the 3L movement? Our answer is this. Our current societal structures and institutions were not built to last. Joseph Tainter points out, complex societies eventually collapse under the weight of their own complexity. Live and Let Live offers a roadmap towards a free society that we can coalesce around. It is a bottom-up, grassroots version of the Great Reset. Our aim is to educate as many people about the 3LP so that it can rise out of the ashes of collapsed society, of collapsed complexity. The reason I think this movement will work is we don't need to convince everyone. Conservatively, I would guess that 75% of people, when pushed, would agree with the 3LP if they thought about it. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book, The Tipping Point, suggests that 20% of the population needs to hold a viewpoint if a social movement is to be successful. Historians tell us that maybe 10 to 30% of people supported the American Revolution, which of course was successful. So with vast swathes of the global population looking for an alternative to the status quo, and with a solution that could appeal to all reasonable minds, these numbers point towards optimism. Live and Let Live is a fast-growing community. If you would like to grow it faster by starting your own local chapter, please do get in touch. Our message is free markets, free movement, free speech, free choice at the community level for the issues where reasonable minds disagree. Live and Let Live is not a utopia. We have no solution to heartbreak, and even in a totally non-coercive society, there will always be cracks which will always let in the light. Though ultimately all mountains turn to dust, all human endeavors are but sandcastles to be consumed by the tides of time, this movement is the closest thing to meaningful that I can think of. If art reflects truth, the truth of consciousness is freedom, then working towards a free society is the most beautiful artwork that any of us can co-create. We have that opportunity now. Whether it's God, the universe, ancestors, or whoever it is that has bestowed this earth upon us, I say thank you. The way I say thank you, in more than just words, is to join the Live and Let Live global peace movement, and I hope you do the same. I'll end with the words of Thomas Paine, a founding father of the USA and a fellow Englishman. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. Collective belief defines our reality. Once we believe we are free, we will be. I believe the Live and Let Live global peace movement is the best vessel to carry us to our destination, and I hope that you will join us on that journey. Peace.
Does it work? Yeah.
Yeah.
Raphael, my name. Thanks for the great ideas. From what I understood, you have the mission, it's a global peace movement, right? And I think for most people, the question of peace is like peace is the opposite of war. So we are talking actually about the international level. And everything you were talking about is more of a interaction between people on the personal level. Would you talk maybe a little bit about the implications on the international level? I mean, it's simple to say we are for peace, right, on the international level. And maybe you could take the Ukraine war as an example. How would you resolve it with your approach? Okay.
So first, to answer it with a metaphor, if a nation is like a building and each individual in that nation is like a brick, if each brick is built well, i.e. if each brick can adhere to the non-aggression principle, the building will stand steady. And so we can't change a nation because we can't change every person at the same time, but we can agree with 10 to 30% of people in a nation that they want to live non-coercively, non-aggressively, and those active 10 to 30% of people can then write into law these legal principles into a constitution that would prevent any initiation of aggression, whether that be on a local or international level. So, yeah,
okay.
Raphael.
Just, I think these principles, at least on the international level, that, you know, we have army to protect us and so on, are in every constitution. So they are written in the law. Nevertheless, we have the wars, and Maybe you could take the example of the Ukraine war to explain how would you solve
Sure. So, you know, if Ukraine represents all of us here, and we've all agreed to live and let live, and a foreign invader was to invade, the first thing I would say is that we wouldn't be pointing aggressive weapons towards our neighbor, because that would be an initiation of a substantial risk of harm. I'm not getting into the politics, so I don't know enough about it, but that would be one thing that would be true for us as a nation. So we wouldn't be so threatening to a neighbor. But also, if a neighbor was to invade, we would have complete freedom to defend ourselves in whichever way we felt best. I.e., again, self-defense is not an initiation of aggression. So I think most likely what would happen is people would outsource that self-defense to professionals. And in fact, there would be a competitive market for that self-defense, so that the cost of self-defense was lower and maybe the effect was more potent. So yeah, there's lots of ways that you need to take over.
We actually, I would like to thank you. Sorry for interrupting you. I wanted you to finish the sentence. So I just wanted to stay on stage while you finish the sentence, but it's okay. I actually thank you so much, because we are very much on time. And adding on what Rafael said a little bit, and I think this is very much compatible with the 3L, because you say, okay, somebody initiates aggression, but you say, well, here I have a constitution. Well, paper is not going to work, right? Like if somebody points a gun at me and I hold a constitution, like I'm not going to be in a good position then, you know, like I would be harmed. But I think the answer to this, because I understand we are not talking about any kind of current politics, we are talking about a form of ideal we want to evolve into, right? So I would say that is the dispersion of power, right? So that it's not that we have a constitution, but we have a nice dispersion of power, which means nice dispersion of weapons, decentralization of weapons, right? Armed society is polite society. So I would go into this direction here.
Agreed, yeah. And you also did a great job of, I mean, I didn't even need to say anything. The way you introduced Live and Let Live at the beginning was perfect, so thank you. If not, then I will say thank you very much, and wish you, yeah. Oh, go for it, yeah. A few words about Liberland. I don't know much about Liberland, but I know that someone here is a member. So does anyone else know about Liberland that wants to say something? If not, I think it's an awesome idea. Is their motto as well? It's great that they have that motto, and I didn't realize. But anyway, cool. Thank you.
Maybe one little comment. If you look at the logo, why don't we make the green dot, like the green thing, a bit smaller and the blue thing a bit bigger? Oh, yeah. So the next council meeting, you know, bring that up.